the launch of Backtalker, an American Memoir, by Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw. And so in today's event, Professor Crenshaw will give us a reading from her new book, which will be followed by a response from Professor Clare Hemmings. We'll then follow up with a conversation between the speakers before opening up to a few audience questions. Now, I expect that we'll have a lot of questions in the room, and we have limited time to take them, so I would encourage you to think already about what your question might be so you can be prepared when the time comes, and I would also like you to think about concise questions. Because one of my duties as chair is to do the boring bits, I have to let you know that there's no fire drill scheduled for our event. So in the event of a fire alarm, please make your way out, and our assembly point is the Saucy Hawk Center, or outside the Skidatunia building. But with that out of the way, let me formally introduce our speakers to you. And this is a tricky task because it's become something of a cliche to introduce a speaker as somebody who needs no introduction. But it's not every day that you get to introduce somebody whose work has so profoundly shaped feminist theorizing and activism across the world. So it's my honor to introduce Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw. Professor Crenshaw is a pioneering scholar and writer on civil rights, Black feminist legal theory, and race, racism, and the law. She was a founder and has been a leader in the intellectual movement called critical race theory, and is also known for introducing and developing the concept of intersectionality. She's a distinguished professor of law at the University of California, Los Angeles, and the Isidore and Seville Sulzbacher Professor of Law at Columbia Law School, and she's also the co-founder and executive director of the African American Policy Forum. Welcome, Professor Crenshaw. Professor Crenshaw is joined tonight by an intellectual giant in her own right, our very own Professor Clare Hemmings. Professor Hemmings is Professor of Feminist Theory in the Department of Gender Studies at London School of Economics, where she's worked since 1999. Her main interests are histories of queer feminist theories and the development of alternative stories and methods with a particular focus on archives. She's the author of Bisexual Spaces, Why Stories Matter, and Considering Emma Goldman, and editor of 9 edited volumes and special issues on these themes. Her current project is Feminist Knowledge Struggles, Telling Stories Differently, which develops an original queer feminist methodologies to challenge the amenability of gendered and sexual discourses to the right. So, without further ado, I know you're not here to listen to me. I will hand over to Professor Crenshaw to give us a little reading from your book.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be back here. So I've been asked to read a selection or two. I initially was going to read the preface, but I realized that this was the first place that I performed the preface in 2017, and there was another story I was going to do, but I realized I've done that here too. So the good news is you're going to hear a couple excerpts that I haven't done yet. So you ready? So let me first say again that the book is a memoir. By that, I mean I'm telling the stories about the experiences that I had that I tried to make sense of through theorizing what I thought those experiences were teaching me about life lived in the early stages of the civil rights movement, life lived as a Black person, life lived as a woman, life lived as a Black person who was a woman and a woman who was a Black person. So these are all the kind of stories that allowed me to begin to think, oh, there's a there that has not yet been fully thought about within the various movements that claimed me as one of its subjects. The stories sort of run the gamut between deeply personal, traumatic stories, a few that are somewhat humorous. I would start with one that is somewhat humorous and then end with one that's a little bit more contemporary. So what I'm about to read is from the section after I left law school and decided that I perhaps might want to be a law professor, but the question was, how might I become such a professor when the industry was basically both white and male? What would it mean, and what were the challenges, and how would I find a space as being neither of those things? So here we go. I arrived in Madison, Wisconsin in the fall of 1984, thrilled to be pipelined into a profession that would allow me to think and write about what I wanted to think and write about. Had I come along a decade earlier, or even a few years earlier, the doors that opened for me would have remained closed, especially given the kind of questions that I was asking. This was also a time when feminist consciousness raising was still a common practice. The feminist legal scholars I was most familiar with focused on the many ways that law regulated gender and regulated women to second-class status in the home, the workforce, and in the political system itself. At the same time, the matriculation of people of color created a critical mass of similarly oriented thinkers who, like feminists, gravitated toward each other in parallel consciousness-raising conversations. As we raised pointed questions about the narrow scope of mainstream constitutional law, race-focused scholarship was becoming a point of contention. The landmark cases in gender discrimination had come late in the century, almost 2 decades after Brown, and some featured men as plaintiffs rather than women. Men were not always breadwinners, and gender-based rules that gave benefits to female dependents of male servicemen, but not for male dependents of servicewomen, were successfully challenged as sex discrimination. There was certainly a point to be made about gender stereotypes, but emerging critical feminists, sometimes called femcrits, argued that the relationship between gender and the law went beyond what the courts were calling sex discrimination to what more radical feminists were demanding, i.e., the dismantling of patriarchy. I found these critiques exhilarating, enlightening, and empowering. Yet the interesting and sometimes frustrating thing for an emerging Black feminist in these spaces was that, although many of the ideas and debates around race and gender were parallel, there existed precious few spaces where these critical projects were in active conversation with each other. It was the constant desire to synthesize these projects that opened the space for critical race theory and intersectionality. My agenda as a graduate student and aspiring legal academic was to master the academic skills I needed to excel, the literature I needed to engage with, and the arguments I needed to employ. But much of what would eventually drive me to articulate intersectionality didn't come from assuming the thinker's pose. It came from both the mundane and the extraordinary ways that, in my personal life, I encountered a milieu that did not yet anticipate the thinking or the presence of someone who was neither white nor male. When I was invited to David Trubeck's home, this was my advisor, for my first soiree, I arrived alone and was met at the door by David Trubeck's spouse, Louise, a spitfire energy who ran the legal services clinic in Madison. Amid lively chatter and tinkling glasses, soon dinner was announced. On cue, the crowd filed into the dining room to take seats at a table elegantly set for a dinner party. There were about 10 of us seated around the table, and while there was small talk at both ends, the arrival of the main course signaled the beginning of the main event, dinner time of repartee. On this occasion, David was hosting one of the younger kids, like me, another protege of Duncan Kennedy's, who was making quite a splash in critical legal studies circles. I was seated on the other side of him. I watched with creeping anxiety that I wouldn't be able to play as effectively as my co-protege, who was proving to be great at both the banter and at his sub-soto side commentary to me. When at last the time came for dessert and coffee, David transitioned the group into what, by all appearances, was a standard evening ritual. David's colleagues and students were ushered into the library to continue the evening's dialogue over drinks and cigars, while their spouses retreated to the living room for coffee and tea. Perplexed about where the student who wasn't male and a female who wasn't a spouse was supposed to go, I sat for a moment as the other men in the room pulled back the chairs of wives to release them into their coffee touch. The sound of my chair's sudden movement across the hardwood floor punctuated my decision. I followed the men into the library and dropped myself into a square club chair. As everyone settled in for the final act of the evening, David reached for a box of cigars and presented the options for each man to select. Just before he reached me, he closed the box and pivoted toward the others. "So what, David, no cigar for me?" "Oh, but of course," David said, spinning back around in one smooth, princely gesture while opening the box. "I shouldn't have assumed," he said, bowing toward me with a grin that suggested, "So what do we have here?" "No, you should have." I sat up in the chair to match his unspoken question with an air of faux indignity and a sly smile. The problem with this playful banter, I suddenly understood, was that once I was committed, I couldn't quite quit the performance. I pulled out a fat cigar and tried to eye what the men were doing with theirs. Unwrapping mine, I paid close attention to the cutting, the lighting, and the stoking to keep it lit. Okay, I got this. David, now treating me as one of the fellas, held out a flame for me to light the cigar. But in fact, I missed one very important detail. I managed to control the slight puffs that I'd watched the others do to hold the fire in the cigar. But my success in finally achieving the glowing ember at the end of the cigar opened to a fatal cockiness. Leaning back into the club chair, I inhaled the ill-fated drag of the devil's. My body jerked forward as the massive cough I was struggling to suppress turned into hot lava in my lungs, screaming to be let out. Noticing my struggle to avoid humiliation, my fellow protege snapped out of his wide-eyed rubbernecking and gave me cover by redirecting the group's attention to the earlier dinner conversation. As the evening concluded, it was agreed that I would give the guest of honor a lift to his hotel. "I really thought you were going to pass out," he said, laughing as he folded his tall frame into my tiny Ford Fiesta. "Pass out," I said, turning down the thumping beat of Morris Day's Jungle Love that I'd been blasting all the way over. "I thought I was going to die, and the jury is still out about what I did to myself back there." The next day, I woke up with a sore throat, a punishing cough, and a glimpse of my determination to fake it until I made it. And this comes from the epilogue. On the 60th anniversary of Bloody Sunday, March 7, 2025, I found myself standing on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama. Surveying the scene, my eyes fixed on a turquoise water tower far in the distance, on the side of which was painted, "Selma, a nice place to live." I wondered whether those bold letters presided over the scene of that fateful day in 1965, when police officers, under the direction of Alabama's segregationist governor, brutally beat scores of African Americans, injuring some for life. Images of officers on horseback, chasing and indiscriminately clubbing men women and children, leaving them bleeding, crying, dazed, and stumbling in clouds of tear gas, flooded the nightly news. Those images shocked my family as we gathered around the black and white television set. We were nearly 800 miles away, but my family understood that even though their parents had fled the South, just like millions of others, this tooth and nail fight impacted African Americans everywhere. These searing images underscore what Langston Hughes observed decades earlier. Negroes do not have to be told what fascism is in action. We know. Just as billy clubs pushed back the foot soldiers for democracy in Selma, the anti-woke assault is determined to reverse the progression toward integration, power, and justice. Although this level of retrenchment is shocking to some, this American faction has risen multiple times before. It operates under various brands across time. Redeemers in the 19th century, massive resistors after Brown in the 20th century, MAGA in the 21st century. All are willing to use force, suppression, and unquestioned authority to advance their anti-democratic aims. Nostalgia for the past, before the end of slavery, before the rise of civil rights, before the election of Obama, is the glue that holds them all together. We backtalkers have become a target of censorship and disinformation in the years since the President of the United States refused to denounce racist protesters in Charlottesville, Virginia. This is billed as merely a cultural war over memory, language, and ideas, but this often obscures the fact that it is a war that materially produces human casualties. When the government bans research on the maternal mortality gaps that disproportionately impact Black women across all socioeconomic classes, or when it defunds efforts to address the overexposure of Black communities to toxic waste dumps, or when it prohibits efforts to revise discriminatory algorithms determining eligibility for kidney transplants, all because this work embraces equity, non-discrimination, and anti-racism, real lives of real human beings are lost. Yet unlike bodies on a battlefield, the body count this war produces will not mount in the public's awareness because the aggressors have eliminated the capacity to even see these casualties. We are required to be colorblind. As the disinformation against ideas that I have championed throughout my career have grown, I'm often asked how I'm doing. Truthfully, I'm not certain how to answer that question. It would be disingenuous to say that this shit show is rolling off of me like water off a duck's back. But the barrage actually does take a toll. That is their point. It's supposed to take a toll. But if the question is whether I'm backing down, the answer would be a hard no. This duck is still paddling, made faster, harder, and with a greater sense of purpose than ever before, but still paddling. In the same way that we must bend the arc of the moral universe towards justice, legal education has to grapple with the law's role in creating the conditions that still hobble our efforts to stand together as a nation. We must equip future generations with the critical tools necessary to move us farther away from our troubled past, not doom us to repeat it. In the midst of all of this, I am a backtalker. I don't know if I am this by choice or was made this way by circumstance of the family I was born and raised in, the body I live in, the century I was born in, or the nation I was made in. In the end, I suppose it doesn't matter. What does matter for me and for backtalkers everywhere is how do we move now? My hope is that the future will look back at this moment to tell a story. One about how the spirit of freedom was nurtured by talking back against agendas that turned on ignorance and forced compliance. I hope ours will be a legacy that lives through efforts to nurture, sustain, and grow a democracy that is shaped not from the top down, but instead by the victories of those who rose up to create new possibilities forever.
Everyone, and welcome to this really wonderful event. Thank you for thinking of us, Kim, when you were planning to come to London to launch your new book. It's an immense honour. It's deeply appropriate for you to read from your wonderful political memoir here, as you know, because we were privileged back in 2019 to hear some early forays in the direction of the more personal parts of the book. I'm thinking here of your memory of being repeatedly promised and then denied the primary school role of Thorn Rosa, or what I think of as the Princess Incident. Your white teacher keeps telling you you'll have the role you've been preparing for tomorrow, and when tomorrow comes, it's too late. The scene that you begin Backtalker with raises questions pertaining to racism and femininity that you were forced to learn as a 5-year-old, that white promises that are never intended to be kept keep black people in a position of yearning for bankrupt recognition. You only need to learn that lesson once, impressively, though it's a harsh one. You've extended those reflections here in your book, explaining too how your family hold you and affirm the pain of both the experience and your realization of its significance. It is a story of hurt then, but also of collective reparation and recognition as deeply affective. Also in 2019, I know that you remember the workshop that you ran on intersectionality for our students one warm afternoon. I was chairing, and we just started when we were interrupted by a white man who started shouting in Italian, calling you names that you didn't need to speak Italian to understand, and moving towards you rapidly as he talked over you. Do you remember the talking him back? You carrying on speaking your truth, us walking him away from the students and out into the hall. And the subsequent workshop in which you showed how intersectional method and practice could help the dazed and traumatized group make sense of what it was that had just happened, until we all felt the collective power of the recognition of violence and the refusal to allow that to be what we left with. The hands-on, loving, fully theorized politics of necessity in the face of a racist, misogynist viciousness that has only got worse in the 7 years since. And do you remember too our post-workshop conversation over drinks about the carceral impulse to deliver this interloper over to security despite managing it effectively ourselves? The reflections on hierarchies and privileges of mental health and class, as well as the imperatives to resist misogyny, racism, and homophobia. We bonded then with you as a department and as friends on the importance of resistance and alternative values, but also on the uncertainties about where all this was going, as well as how to reach out across difference. I read your political memoir, Backtalker, this weekend in a concentrated block of time, turning the pages furiously, needing to know what would happen next. I am in awe, Kim, of your capacity in this tripartite text to draw a line through your familial and childhood educational and group experiences into college and your development of tools to answer these burning questions about authority, alternative values, community, recognition and political feeling, and then on into your institution building and unwavering support for the most vulnerable and unheard. We know you already as the brilliant black feminist, legal scholar activist who developed the concept of intersectionality and inaugurates and fights for critical race theory both then and now. But this book reflects our own experience here at the department of you as first and foremost an unrelenting, staunch advocate for justice, willing to go to bat for those whose well-being you insist on as a political right in the face of authoritarian aggression. Challenging authority and changing the terms. What you've done throughout your life, and it has often cost you dearly, as the book lays out. You have told power that it has no right to wield its violence, and you have been punished, pushed to one side, and forced to look to other contexts, histories of black rights thinking and action, familial affirmation, and challenge for recognition. Where you found nothing to guide you, you've never fallen into despair for long. You've kept on at power and kept on with others to generate the history, theory, and collective energy to craft what is absent. You transform Harvard Law School's practice, you generate new concepts, you refuse to be drawn into arguments that generate false oppositions between black and feminist thinking, for example, and you build institutions for policy and political change. Say Her Name's changing of the debate is but one powerful example. With others, you've rooted yourself in alternative values and have always striven to build communities of practice that allow for that recognition to take place through attachment to something else. Through the book, this is where your disappointment shows itself most raw, when others fail to step up, when people remain silent, when you backtalk, or worse, fail even to remember that you reached out for a support that was not forthcoming. The book could be read, I think, as a searing critique of racism and misogyny, of course, but also as an indictment of the bystander and the political coward, the ones who leave you and others in the lurch time and time again, from comrades who let you take the heat to the Obama administration and its deep betrayals. The loneliness of the task you've set yourself over your lifetime seeps through the pages of your book, and it's a brave thing indeed to acknowledge that in your writing. Resistance. In your book, resistance thrums like blood as you carve an account of your life, its politics and commitments in terms of the difference backtalking has made and which people are at its centre. Resistance for you is a conversation among those who want change, among those who are disadvantaged by the powers that be, by racism, sexism, homophobia and transphobia, who need to work out what tactics to hold on to and which to ditch in any given moment. Resistance for you is an ongoing discussion about what's worth the level of risk and what not, what's worth the unrecognised labour and what isn't, which battles one will fight to the end and which one brackets for later, are judgments that you insist have to be made in the moment for resistance to have a future rather than only a present. The strategies that you identify as able to underwrite that ongoing resistance struggle are myriad. And here I want to outline the ones that have stayed with me, and I suggest that you pay attention, activist scholars in the making, in the audience, in order to hold them to your heart. First, the embrace of the losing battle, which bubbles throughout, but of course comes full circle in your epilogue and in the 2024 US election. Second, the refusal to let racist or sexist violence, including sexual violence, be sidelined or recast as identity politics. Third, an unflinching commitment to where harm lies and who needs support. Fourth, the embrace of the outsider position, the backtalker mode, the one who weathers the storm with or without others. Fifth, the development of the sixth sense, hard won, of what endures and what is necessary in a given moment, and not being afraid to revisit commitments. The crafting of black womanhood and intersectional perspectives as a universal position from which to theorise is number 6. 7, refusal to participate in false camaraderies of femininity so that women's relationships to one another become marked by comradeship rather than competition or failure to support. I've lost count of my numbers, but the next one is reaching out to others. Pick up that phone, I've written, and my goodness, through the book you do, time and time again, to your mum, to Luke, to Toni Morrison. The phone calls are worth reading the book just for those. Writing and politics from affect, that's my last strategic pull-out, from the difference emotion makes to who you are and what you can do. Finally then, I want to reflect a little on that affective dimension and its central importance in Backtalker. From the grief you experience when your father dies, quote, a grieving 10-year-old girl thrown out of her known universe by a thunderbolted, soul-shattering, life-altering loss. To your rage at all the times, quote, they stood silently by, unquote. The good times you have often take place in spaces in between, I noticed. You're always on the move. We already know that about you. Trips in the car, celebrations of successes at people's houses, musical immersion and dancing, holidays, caucuses, protests, pizza parties, swimming pools. And take place, they certainly do, with laughter and care as well as heartbreak. Come on, sis, swim to me, says your brother, Mantel, in a rare moment of pure connection. And of course, you do. And you scream with laughter with your black friends, reclaiming the horrors of racism through refusals again and again throughout the book. Quote, our laughter was cutting and complex, you say, enabling you all to weather humiliation together and transform it into something else. You also take forward your mother's formidable determination that comes through so strongly. She says to a teacher who has sought to humiliate you, quote, every day I wake up with one mission, and that mission is to ensure that no one and nothing gets in my daughter's way. And that means every last one of the teachers here, and you, I do not want to have to come here again, your mother says. And you sure don't want me to come up here again. Do we understand each other? I am sure your mother passed you many legacies, but I hear you in her here so clearly. These affects bubble through your book, your life, your politics. These craft you as a black feminist in becoming, as you describe it. And it is the loneliness and laughter and love of your rich engagement with the fabric of life that carries you through. These are effective methods crafted for a black feminist toolkit in your context, but they are, I think, translatable to so many other contexts. I'm thinking about the joy and laughter on the marches against the far right in the UK in recent weeks, and the community rage and heartbreaking grief expressed in the ongoing actions for an end to the genocide in Palestine over the last years. In the determination in the civil disobedience movements that have emerged in response to craven flaunting of ethics and law transnationally too. Your methods have always been translatable and universal. Now, more than ever, thank you for your work.
it might be hard for me to put words together. Claire, thank you.
Thank
so
you.
much for such a close reading. You know, it's rare to have someone who takes the care to read not only the line, but what's between the line. And that you mind it for every last nuance just leaves me without words. So thank you. I got to get myself together a little bit. So you go ahead.
I'm a softball. Because, you know, as you're probably aware, we're in a room with lots of gender studies scholars.
Yeah.
And many of us have learned your name through the concept of intersectionality. And I was hoping to prompt you to tell us a little bit more. You share so many stories in the book, but if you could tell us a little bit about the story behind intersectionality of what brought you to the epiphany moment. And perhaps looking forward, did you anticipate that it would be taken up all around the world and put onto t-shirts? and the impact that it's had.
Okay. So I have talked in various moments, including on this stage, about the analytic objective that I was trying to pursue by articulating intersectionality as I call it a remedial concept, and by that I mean judges needed help to understand the contours of a life that many of us live every day, and it seemed to really be perplexing to them. So I was trying to use something that was common, that was something that they encountered on a day-to-day basis, take that knowledge and put it on top of the kind of claims that Black women were making, and judges were rejecting their claims. So that's sort of the big picture. In the book, I try to go back even further and talk about the context of the late 80s, in particular, the conditions of intersectionality's possibility in the law came from the sequential development of discrimination law on the basis of race, then quickly followed by anti-discrimination law on the basis of gender. And that was more or less a unique moment in the law, because the concepts that were being developed and that were being used by lawyers gave us a concrete foundation to understand what was missing, like why these plaintiffs were not able to be successful. Of course, if you didn't have a history of race discrimination law in which individual plaintiffs were actually making claims, or if the gender development had happened sometime far before or far after, you wouldn't have had that, historical happenstance that both of these things were seen in parallel, and thus you could understand how the parallelism was a distortion of the underlying problem. So I counted myself actually kind of lucky that I was writing and thinking exactly at that moment, because it hadn't happened before. I also counted myself lucky to have been part of two discursive formations at the time. I mentioned them in the little excerpt that I was doing. Feminist consciousness raising was a thing, and it was hot, and people were involved in it, and I was trying to be a hot student, and so I was going to this stuff, and I was like, oh man, I do not know what Simone de Beauvoir is writing about, but I'm trying to figure it out. I mean, I was reaching for stuff in my early 20s, and I was surrounded by a very supportive community. I think it was also useful in that moment that community was one that was multiracial. I did have experiences of community and solidarity with women who are not women of color. So I lived a life that told me that there were possibilities, so that my feminism didn't develop out of an opposition necessarily to the feminist project, or even an opposition to white feminists. And the same thing I would say with respect to the race project. I came along during a time that we were basically the first full generation of law students of color to be brought into law schools in mass. And that happenstance allowed us to collectivize our multiple experiences so that we were able to paint a fuller picture of how the law was not simply regulating race, but was regulating how we thought about racial power. So we're in these institutions, we're experiencing racial power. It's not framed as racial power. They're telling us that there aren't, other people of color on the faculty because other people of color aren't qualified to be there. Well, that prompts us to say, well, what counts as qualification? And then when we start listening to what counts as qualification, it turns out basically to be the biography of the white men who were the professors of law at the time. Biographies that were not fully accessible to women and to people of color. So what they were managing to do was simply extrapolate from their pathway, which was a race and gender pathway, turn that into neutral criterion, and then use that to explain why they want more people that look like me in the institution. Now, I would not have arrived at that critique had I been sitting there by myself. I would not have arrived at that critique if I had been there 10 years earlier or 5 years earlier. So it was a very lucky circumstance that all of these things were coming together at the same time. That I was then sitting in a library with my best friend, Jean Ryan, who was sort of my first real critic. And I was trying to think about how to respond to this case I had found in which Black women were basically trying to say, okay, there's this thing going on and we're trying to think more critically about race discrimination, and there's this thing going on and we're trying to think more critically about gender discrimination, but who's thinking about me? Because certainly the judges aren't thinking about me. So intersectionality came out of that moment. I was deeply immersed in both these discourses, but also able to see what neither of them happened to be interrogating at that moment. And so the rest I talk about in the book, responding to the case and trying to figure out how to use the metaphor, and then realizing that the metaphor was actually useful for thinking not just about Black women in an employment context, but ableism and its intersections with being undocumented, or being queer and being working class and having no access to a range of interventions and supports from health to housing that we might otherwise expect. I was able to see that this framework that came out of necessity in trying to articulate this particular problem actually might have greater value when used by other people. Now, here's the last thing. I was never, sort of motivated to say, hey, everybody use this. Not my jam. I don't really care about it, and I don't care about uptake. What I care about is what knowledge do we gain together from the various ways that intersectionality has traveled, the various ways and things that it has shed light on, the various ways that we can rethink how we do politics. I'm a collector of this information, not someone who's hawking an idea that I'm deeply invested in people taking. So when people tell me, intersectionality doesn't speak to such and such, my first thing is to say, well, let's not turn intersectionality into a sentient human being. It is a tool. You can use it if it helps you. And if it doesn't help you, that's cool too. It's not that kind of a project. So I'm always, sort of excited to go to different places and to hear how people use it in their dissertations, how they use it in their social justice lives, or if they find that, there is this limitation, I'm good with that too. I feel like intersectionality and I kind of grew up together from the miracle of our birth sort of happening at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, you have this, if you haven't already got hold of your copy, you have this amazing treat in store, but that's one of the extraordinary threads through Backtalker is your absolute refusal to accept the kind of grammar of oppositions in the political debates that you're engaging, right? And in relationship, I mean, it's interesting then, I mean, I've seen that in your work, particularly, I think, on sexual violence, right, which you have held to as a central question for black feminism, and which in the book you craft all the way through as, you know, just because there are some feminists who want to frame that as a single issue and as a single question around oppression and ignore race in the process of doing it, that doesn't mean that it's not absolutely, in fact it probably means it is, absolutely central to understanding the experience of slavery, the experience of black women contemporarily, and so on, and that's really important. It comes, of course, to a head when you're talking about the Anita Hill case, and, you know, I was really struck, I mean, you have this conversation with, it's not so much a conversation, is it, but it's a back talking to your cab driver, where you basically say, why should solidarity be a one-way street, my friend? Right? Where, because of the demonization that happens to Anita Hill and to other black women that you highlight throughout the book, when sexual violence is called out. And I think that's, you know, it's not the only way in which you insist that feminism is absolutely central to the project that you're engaging, and that you refuse to see opposition between, you know, gender and race, but it's super important, I think, and I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that.
Yeah. Well, one of the reasons why I returned to that story, especially given the fact that it's now, you know, old history to most people in this room. It felt like yesterday to me. One can trace so many of the consequences that we're dealing with now in our democracy to that moment that I call intersectional failure. And by that I mean that the common political interest that feminists, stakeholders in racial justice, stakeholders in democracy had in opposing the rightward drift of the Supreme Court failed to come together in that moment. And it wasn't as though it couldn't have happened, because there was another nominee prior to Clarence Thomas who was equally conservative. His name was Judge Bork. And all of these groups came together and effectively defeated his nomination. So it was clearly possible that the intersections of interest, the ways that the different power grabs that were on the table, that were about to happen through Supreme Court rulemaking, could be arrested with an effective enough understanding of the overlapping interests. So why did it happen when it was a black male Supreme Court, deeply, deeply conservative, far right-wing nominee? And so some part of it that I acknowledged even from the beginning was a simplistic idea that our interests are served by having someone who looks like us on a decision-making body. Now that was contested even before Anita Hill came forward, but still it was a hard fight. So a lot of the racial justice groups were asked to take a back seat, wait and listen to the actual testimony before they made a decision. And all while that happened, you know, the Bush White House was really, really busy generating a narrative that they could sell to the black community, that this person was for them, this person, you know, was the one who was going to carry the torch forward. Thurgood Marshall, who was the one who had argued Brown versus Board of Education, was, you know, the civil rights attorney of the 20th century. So there was this public campaign to reposition Clarence Thomas as the next step in our civil rights struggle, all the way to coming up with new organizations called, the Organization of Families for Racial Justice. I mean, all kinds of names. They're white front organizations, but it did the work of confusing people. But even given all that work, they were kind of mixed on whether they supported Clarence Thomas until Anita Hill testified. And when Anita Hill testified about the experiences that she had as a Black woman working for him, and Clarence Thomas came and denounced that as a high-tech lynching, that was the moment where, the earth opened up and all possibilities of maintaining that coalition just fell into the lava underneath. Why did that happen? One of the reasons it happened is that the groups were already there. Racial justice and feminism already were seen as parallel tracks, and sometimes they were seen as mutually exclusive tracks, especially when it came to violence, especially when it came to violence against women, and especially when it came to violence against Black women. So much so that when Anita Hill came forward and Clarence Thomas had framed her testimony as a high-tech lynching, most people who ended up supporting him fully erased her as a Black woman, fully erased the history of Black women being subject to gender-based violence, fully erased the fact that sexual harassment had been a condition of Black women's work since we were imported to the United States. I mean, that is how deep that history is, but also how erased it was. So my experience in that moment, and I remember Luke Harris and I, who went on to found the African American Fathers Forum. Quick fact, I met Luke because we put out a call to Black men across the United States to come to Washington, D.C. to help us push back against this misappropriation of the lynching frame, to say that Black men were standing behind Anita Hill and not allowing Clarence Thomas, who, by the way, never met any anti-racist that he actually supported. Okay? So he was basically wrapping himself up, we said, in the bloody rope in order to get onto the Supreme Court. So we thought we needed Black men to come and say this. We needed them to fill in, that chasm that was opening up. 2 Black men showed up and knocked on my door at 2 o'clock in the morning. And one of them, was Luke Harris, who had been actually a classmate of Clarence Thomas. So we went through this whole, thing of trying to mobilize, motivate, push back against this framework. At the end of the day, we were not successful. I have a whole story in the book about, joining a prayer service that we thought was for Anita Hill, but it turned, Black women led prayer service, and turned out it was for Clarence Thomas, not for Anita Hill. We were absolutely shocked. But we were sitting on the stairs of the Supreme Court when he was finally confirmed. I said to Luke, this is going to change the rest of our lives. Luke said, and all because we didn't want to believe a Black woman. That refusal to believe her is a product of the either or. Either you're for racial justice and against feminist accountability, or you're for feminist accountability and you're against Black men. And the way it's able to work is through the imposed silence on Black women and the erasure of our history, and the fact that Black women were the ones that actually came up with, the claim that sexual harassment was discrimination, or the very first plaintiffs who were making that claim. You've got to erase all of that for that oppositionalism to actually work and to be reproduced and to be passed on without people having any sense that there is an erasure going on. So I look at this intersectional moment of failure and tie it to the crisis that we have today. Because with that 5th vote that Clarence Thomas provided. We lost campaign finance reform. So one of the reasons why billionaires can basically pick who they want to employ as president of the United States is because the laws that were on the books to try to limit the influence of extraordinary wealth in our politics were basically defeated by the Supreme Court, and Clarence Thomas provided that fifth vote. One of the reasons that communities of color are dramatically less able to elect someone of their choice is because Clarence Thomas provided the fifth vote that undermined the Voting Rights Act, long known as the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. So this intersectional failure, this oppositionalism, is devastating. It's damaging to Black women, to be sure. It's damaging to women of color, to be sure. But it's damaging to our entire democracy. And to the extent that American democracy is now in decline, it endangers the rest of the world, as we clearly see happening right now.
I mean, there's so many things to say about this. I mean, one thing is you talk a lot in the book, and this is something that really interests me. I think will interest a lot of us here. And I'll quote something that relates, that will help us think about it, I hope, which is, you say, the question for me, one that persists to this day, is how to exist in spaces that demand we act as if they are race and gender neutral when they are not. What are the challenges of backtalking when our institutions ask us to maintain the peace and comfort of those who have taken such conditions as their birthright, no matter its impact on us? When, you ask, should we refuse those expectations? That's a big question. Yeah. But maybe you could say something about that also, we're also in contexts in the UK of the increasing failures to address race and gender justice, increasing defunding of institutions, those questions of when and how you make a decision, who's punished and who isn't. Super challenging, right?
Very much so. And you know what? I love hearing it out of context. It's like, well, that sounds pretty good.
Yeah, sorry, I'm like quoting you back to yourself. I will say that one of the freedoms that I really leaned into in writing this as a memoir, when you raise questions in academic texts, you pretty much have to answer them. If you're not going to answer it, then you best not raise it. You kind of get a demerit for doing that. But in a memoir, you can say, I don't fully have a worked out answer to it. I kind of just, stumble along. And so that's one of the issues, like when do you and how do you engage in, and when do you bow or not to the demands of acquiescence? Because the acquiescence gives support to the claims of legitimacy, right? When you acquiesce to asymmetric and subordinating expectations without comment, you allow that institution to tell itself and tell others that it is functioning in, a fair, neutral, et cetera way. And I think it is one reason why I've tried to link together the moments that I've talked back to it, because they weren't always clear moments that there was going to be an immediate victory to the talking back. But what I wasn't going to give the situation was my affirmation, was the legitimation, was the satisfaction. Not only are they putting me in this situation, but they're forcing me to be silent about it. That in some ways, being forced to be silent about it,
is as, you know, I have the first line in the book is, you know, being a backtalker is like being lactose intolerant. There's some things that I just can't digest. It will come out one way or the other. And so, you know, injustice like that is something I can't, like, not, you know, give back, right? And that at least gives me the space and the I can look at myself and say, at least I haven't given over to them my thinking, my consciousness, what I know to be true. I might have to fall in line, but I don't have to suppress my tongue. And sometimes in one of the lines that I have here, that came from my mother. Sometimes you have to fake it till you make it. So even though you don't necessarily see how your talking back is going to immediately turn into a material shifting of the conditions of the possible thing that you're, you know, arguing against, you're keeping the pot warm. You're keeping the injustice of it simmering. You're not allowing yourself to adjust to it, so that eventually you say, okay, I'm cool with it sitting in boiling water. I want to constantly be saying, ouch. I want to be constantly saying, no, this is not normal. This is not okay. This is not the way things should be. And you know, that's a little easier, I have to say, in the context of institutions we're used to fighting against than it is in spaces where we're not, or where the consequences are being excommunicated. And that's often in one's community, it's often in the relationships that count the most to you, it's often in your family, in your home. Those moments of talking back, like with, you know, my brother's keeper, you know, situation with Obama, how do you do that is actually harder, because the actual talking back is saying, I may not be part of the plan. I might be in danger of not having a home that I can come back to. And if your sense of your we is a sense of strength and a source of why am I doing this and how am I measuring, you know, our well-being, not being able to say we are our because you are no longer seen as part of that community. Well, you know, that's one of the most debilitating, you know, fears that I've had. I've done it anyway. And in doing that, coming out on the other side, the allies that I developed in the process, the folks who, you know, were willing to put their name on a full-page ad in the New York Times denouncing the way that Anita Hill was treated, or the number of feminists across gender and race who were willing to say to a president that many people, you know, really worshipped, you're leaving women of color in a burning house is not something we're willing to tolerate. Those are my ride or die people. And knowing that they're there, and knowing that you find your community when you go through the fear of being excommunicated. That's kind of the lesson of my how that I go back to the next time I have to think about how to speak into that abyss.
What a community you've created for so many of us to feel that we can take part or see parts of it. And I'm going to thank you both for comments, and I'm going to open up to some questions from the audience now. I'm going to take a set of 3, and then you can respond to them as well. So, can I see hands for questions, please?
but I wanted to ask a bit about the experience of writing a memoir, and how I suppose that might have reoriented your political identity in any sort of way, and perhaps some like the takeaways of what it means as academics, as myself as an organizer, to sort of reflect on our past and reorienting our current like, political identity, or how that experience of reflecting on our past should inform our work, our research, and stuff.
Sorry, before you pass the mic back, can I ask you to introduce yourselves really briefly?
Yes, I'm Budone. I'm actually not supposed to be here. I'm an American politics student. I actually took my background. And yeah,
Great.
yeah,
Thank you. Yeah, we had one in the great talk.
Hi, my name's Antonia. I'm also not supposed to be. I'm from the law department, and I just wanted to reinforce what was said. I'm very grateful to be here to listen to you, and I have more, so I have my questions. So I kind of go straightforward. Professor, as a Black lawyer in Latin America, I'm from so reading your memoir, I recognize the tension lived between the personal cost of naming what others prefer to, especially, and the necessity of doing it anyways. What would you say to those of us who are still at the beginning of the journey, trying to hold critical honesty and hope at the same time?
I love that the first two people fessed up to you're most welcome. And then in the middle here, Lily, raise your hand.
Hi, thank you. My name is Lily. I am in this department. My question is, given the Supreme Court's politicization and the fact that you originally thought of intersectionality as a remedial concept for judges, I'm wondering how you think of the role of the judge and the judiciary today.
Wonderful questions. And here's the thing, this is Backtalker Conversations on Tour, so all of the people who's moderating with me are also part of this
Nice
discussion. Absolutely. So I might throw one of them directly at you. So, experience in writing the memoir, and I think, what is it, have I rethought? So actually, it was frustrating writing it, not so much because it was a memoir, but the timing in which I was writing it. So the book was initially bought in the middle of the George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, moment of virtually global reckoning. I mean, this was a moment where it looked like there was going to be significant advancement of the overall racial justice project, and in particular, anti-Blackness was once again something that could be named, and its elimination be seen as sort of a norm that was going to be broadly embraced. So I think the book was bought thinking that there was now an audience outside of the academy for these kinds of stories to help, advance what was seen as, this moment. And then almost immediately after I started it, we were in a retrenchment. I wish I could say unlike anything we've ever seen before, but it's not true. We had seen this retrenchment before, in fact, many times before. So I'm writing thinking that, the movement is going this way, but it's actually, coming back to kind of run over the project. So I had to consistently think about, is this still a project that makes sense to do? Is it still useful to write a memoir when intersectionality was being so utterly distorted by, the likes of everyone from Lindsey Graham to of course, Trump, and and a few other people whose name I don't want to say. So did it really make sense to be writing this as a memoir when in fact the political project and the institutions that house this political project, like the university was actually being taken apart. So the hard thing was just staying the course. And I was, eventually I convinced myself, and I think it was the right call, that so much of the attack on these ideas it's self-distorted. In the U.S., intersectionality has been framed as un-American, as a foreign import, as an effort to turn white men into the new pariah class, as divisive, as something that made white children feel bad. I mean, it was all of an abstraction that people just went to some laboratory somewhere and came up with. So I thought it was absolutely critical to say that intersectionality doesn't come from somewhere else. It is deeply grounded in specific kinds of lived experiences from the ground up. This isn't from, grand theory down. It is from, a life that came to life in the earliest periods of the civil rights movement, in a life that watched the flourishing of that movement and subsequent movements, how that flourishing traveled into law, what law did and did not do with it, and what then happened to the things that were done under law. So I wanted to tell a story that pushed back against it. And so that probably was the hardest thing, deciding to stick with it. I'm sure that at some point I might think twice about how much of my personal story I revealed in it, but once I was committed to the idea of a memoir, it just made sense. You signed the dotted line, put it out there, let other people determine whether it makes sense, that doesn't hold together in a way that illuminates what you used your life to try to do. So, hope that's helpful. Let's see, people at the beginning of their career on critical honesty and hope. So I want to acknowledge, as I did earlier, just to try to say that there was a temporality to intersectionality, particularly for a Black feminist who had been shaped by Black feminists of the 70s and 80s and then took that Black feminism into the discipline of law. So much of what is possible and how we do what we do is sort of temporally located. I mean, I didn't come to this work in a period of active fascist retrenchment. It was neoliberal retrenchment, and so it presented its own, challenges that, I won't say I figured it out. I think, certain things were possible at the moment, and certain things were consequential, but I kept on the pathway and tried to navigate those things. I don't want to be glib about this moment, because I was just saying, earlier, that sometimes conditions are changing and you won't know how much they've changed or what kind of risk you're facing until it's revealed that, deals have been made or certain people or certain issues are going to be sacrificed. We're not getting, well, actually we are kind of getting a list. They're kind of telling us. All right, they're all going to be sacrificed no matter how serious it is. So I want to be cautious about saying, just do what I did, because it's a different time. And at the same time, I want to say, nobody could have told me in the 70s, in the 80s, what or how to navigate that. So, the civil rights giants of the 60s, they didn't know what these law schools were like when we went into them. In fact, they were so clueless about it that many of them criticized us for making a fuss and protesting the racial terms of our existence in these institutions. From their vantage point, the main thing was for us to get in. and we should get in there and make them proud and not embarrass them. So there was only so much that they could actually, help us think through. So with those two caveats, I'll just say this. I think the strength of my feelings about things kept me focused enough until I could understand and theorize them and put names to them. As long as I was stepping in the same direction of this, actually, there's something messed up about this, and I'm gonna figure out what it is, or there's something that I simply cannot accept about this explanation. I know these professors or this dean, they've got years ahead of me. They can wrap, they can wrap my thinking around their little finger, but I'm going to figure it out. That kind of imperative that wouldn't allow me to set it aside or let it go, following that path is what led to the, I think, epiphanies and the ability to theorize the things that they said there was no there. So at the end of the day, I guess I'm saying, your passion is important because your passion actually is connected to your analytic capacity. I did that, and so therefore I was, a little bit more willing to pay the consequences of it because I felt like I was aligned between my experience, my mission, and whatever skill set that I was bringing to the table. What was the last one? In the role of the law. I have to say, I do reflect back on some of the critiques that we were dealing with in critical legal studies. One of the main things that the left was doing was critiquing the rule of law, critiquing the idea that we should aspire to some kind of transcendent, above politics belief. And our calling card was law is politics. Our calling card was there is no above. Law is just a different rhetorical register in which to articulate deeply held political ideas. So we should talk about it in precisely that way. I still feel that, right? I still feel it, but I also feel like, gee, it was great when people felt like they had to perform, that there was some kind of rule of law. Right? Gee, it was great when people who wanted to go about something felt that they had to go through the appropriate procedures to do it, rather than just write a dang on executive order and write out like some huge percentage of people in a particular population. So I have developed a grudging respect for the idea of proceduralism that I kind of scoffed at, when I was a law student. And, I don't know if I'm ready to apologize yet, but I will say that there is some benefit to that. I think my overall feeling about judges and the law is, I felt this for a long time, that the right has been far more realist about their view about courts and the law than the left has been. What do I mean by that? They started out in the late 1950s with the idea that we are going to just take over the courts again. They weren't really saying, well, we've lost the argument about Brown. What we have to do is go back and come up with some other kind of argument to reclaim, our way of life. They were like, no, we got to get rid of these judges. We need to replace them. That's never been the conversation that the left has had, really, about the law. And so now, 60 years hence, that project is simply taking over the judiciary, is panning out for them. And on our side, we rarely actually made a point of the judiciary, even in presidential election. There was this feeling that that's a little too political. It's a little too, issue oriented. It's a little too identity politics oriented. We don't want to go in that direction. And that was a mistake. That was a mistake. When you think about all of the voters that voted for candidate A as opposed to candidate B, because candidate A promised to appoint judges who were going to overturn Roe versus Wade, that meant there was a whole population of voters who understood that they were voting on the Supreme Court. And they weren't being matched by people who would say, I'm going to appoint judges who are going to uphold the Voting Rights Act, or uphold affirmative action, or uphold any number of other things. So when you have one side that is deeply committed and they're lined up in terms of their ideology, in terms of their funding, in terms of their strategy and their tactics, and you have another side that doesn't even realize they're in that fight, or turns their nose up to the fight, you cannot win an asymmetrical war. You cannot win a war where one side is on the field and the other side is still trying to get their act together. And so that, I think, is just happening, you know, in a huge way with respect to the courts and the law. And that, you know, that's why we're at a point where rulemaking, lawmaking may not hold the line as much as many people want it to as we descend into fascism. Oh, come on, you guys can have something.
We have a few minutes, so I'm going to take, we have two questions of less than a minute each, and then we're going to give about 3 minutes to respond before we wrap up. So we go this side of the room in the back.
Hi, my name is Amanda. I am a gender and human rights student here, and my question is kind of particular to your experience at the University of Wisconsin, because I myself graduated there in May. And in my time there, I saw a complete lack of support from the institution, particularly during instances of hate speech and racist professors, and also during the encampments last, I guess, 2 years ago, I'm not quite sure. And I'm just wondering how you engage in backtalking there and within your community and with other students, and how you engage like with lack of support from the institution if there was at that time.
Hi, my name is Ranga. I'm a PhD student at the University Department. So my question is, so when we speak of gender-based violence against Black women by Black men often tend to be very defensive about.
Sorry.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Black men often what?
Black men often tend to get defensive about these conversations, and I think that's partly because these can be weaponized to reinforce racist narratives about Black men and further justify their unjust incarceration. So when both of these oppressions are very real, like Black women's oppressions, but also Black men's. So how do you navigate these intra-community tensions? I hope it was clear.
Oh, okay, sorry. I was looking for that, Mike. Okay, so how I engage in backtalking during a period in which, the framing of free speech is really all over the place. So, I can just tell you that in this moment in which, suddenly those who have traditionally been committed to free speech to the point that they were willing to say to my cohort that hate speech, even assaultive speech, which is direct, in your face, hateful things that are threatening, when we were seeking some kind of protection against that kind of thing, university administrators would say, the cost of free speech is that you just have to tolerate that. Or the response to that kind of speech is more speech. So they call you an N-word, you just speak back, or you just say, no, I'm not. And we were really frustrated by that during some of the earlier periods of my career, and we wrote about some of the dangers and the harms of environments that were being saturated with this kind of speech, and making it clear that there were recognized cases, legal concepts that understood that harm can be produced through speech. Defamation is harm that can be produced through speech. Threats are harms that can be produced through speech. So the idea of free speech absolutism seemed crazy to us, and we made that argument, and for that we were called the anti-free speech cabal, and it was also part of the attack on wokeism. So you can imagine my surprise when, over the last 3 or 4 years, many of those folks have gotten on the other horse and have been deeply, deeply concerned about how certain speech acts now constitute, clear and present dangers on campus, represent disruptions of the peace, represent intolerable conditions on the campus. So what we have, or what I see in this moment, is what I always thought was happening, that these were viewpoint-based protections of speech, not the idea that all speech, if it's just speech, should be, tolerated. It's really about, well, who are you talking against? Who are you talking for? What positions are you taking? What topics are you talking about? The question that raises for us is, do we now want to embrace a substantively transformative idea? By that I mean, do we want to embrace an idea of free speech that doesn't ask about the topics, but just is a free speech absolutism? Or do we want to try to adopt some kind of approach to free speech that isn't as viewpoint-based as what we see is happening right now, but also can we articulate harm in a way that's concrete enough that covers the kind of harm that happens to traditionally excluded groups, and doesn't give over or allow itself to be used to force us into silence when we've got things that we want to say. And that is actually a very hard question. People are thinking about it, people are talking about it. For me, the first step is pointing out that contradiction. And I've done so. I mean, people who've come after, we have a book called Assaultive Speech with Mario Matsuda, Richard Delgado, and Chuck Lawrence. And some of the folks who came after us, I'm writing them now and saying, you know what, I haven't heard from you in a while. You've seen the speech code that now, my university has adopted, or you see this effort to censor these ideas. You were, against censorship when it was, it was Charles Murray who was arguing, sort of the bell curve, saying that some people were inherently intellectually inferior, but yet I'm not hearing you when critical race theory is being censored, or I'm not hearing you when students are having their encampments dismantled because the message of the encampments are something that some people in administration don't like. So I've been really pushing some, and a few of them have said, I haven't shown up for the value that I've been known for, and so I've seen some of them jump out, but most of them won't. Most of them won't. That is a part of the analysis. That is a part of the critique. So I think that part we can at least say, while we try to figure out what do we think is the legitimate and fair parameters of assaultive speech regulation that also maintains some degree of liberty in what we can say. Okay, on the gender question. So first thing, I'm going to go back to what I said earlier about the memoir. The good thing about the memoir is I can share a story without necessarily saying what I think the full implications are and how to resolve it. So I tell a story of myself, being in a situation that was an abusive situation, and being persuaded by members of my community not to pursue a carceral strategy in response to it, in belief and hope that the community would step up and actually realize the long articulated wish for us to have alternative means of resolution. And I wish I could tell you that that happened. It did not. So I tell the story as a way, again, of saying, I understand the critique. I agree with the critique. And at the same time, I don't know how long we're supposed to wait until we can be free of violence. I don't believe that the state necessarily protects us across the board. I also believe that when I'm being stopped and I pick up the phone and the people who promised that they were going to be there are not there, I shouldn't simply make my body the battlefield in which the debate over carceral justice rages on. So I tell the story as a way of creating an urgency around us doing more than giving lip service to this concern. I also tell the story to force us to ask, is this just a case of asymmetrical solidarity? Or is it truly a deeply held critique of carceral and other kind of punitive strategies? Sometimes I think it is a product of asymmetrical solidarity. And sometimes I think the politics of asymmetrical solidarity allow us to embrace this idea without taking any account of some of the ongoing consequences to women, girls and children who exist downstream from that commitment. So I'm trying to call us back to the table to think this through and not get up until we've figured something out more than what we've got right now.
So a couple of thanks and one announcement. So thank you, Kim, for writing this remarkable book, for your momentous body of work, and for being so generous with your experience and insight with all of us here tonight. Thank you to Clare for that beautiful, insightful reading, which really helped open up different aspects of the work to all of us, and ensure that those who haven't read it yet want to do so. Special thanks to Nina and the team at Penguin and Clare for your fabulous engagement. We are selling copies of the memoir, and we're going to do that on stage, and Kim will sign copies. Like one, and
here.
And I just want to thank all of my good colleagues and friends at LSC. I consider this my third home. So it's so wonderful to be back.